Hello, I'm Jeffrey Williams and welcome to Too Late for the Gods. This video is a response to Michael Millerman's recent video on the YouTube channel Stoa titled Our Heideggerian Moment. I'll forego my usual temptation towards snark or sarcasm because I genuinely respect Dr. Millerman and take him seriously, although I strongly disagree with him. This video is motivated by my deep interest in Martin Heidegger. Despite my being a simple, semi-literate biker who lives under a bridge, there hasn't been a day in more than 30 years where I haven't in some way engaged with Heidegger's thought. Thus is the propitious advantage of dwelling under this bridge, watching the river flow, that a gentleman of leisure such as I has time to ponder such questions. The other motivation is my revulsion of right-wing nationalism, where apologists for illiberalism all too often misinterpret Heidegger to support their agenda. I don't intend to reproduce Dr. Millerman's entire argument here, but will cite only a couple of points I want to directly address. I do strongly urge everyone to watch his presentation, which is linked below. He does a commendable job of presenting his point and required barely 20 minutes to do so at the beginning of the video. Millerman's position is that we are in a time of political crisis, and Heidegger, whose task was to prepare the way for a new beginning, has some important things to contribute. His interpretation of Heidegger is limited to being in time and the so-called pre-turn Heidegger, which Heidegger himself rejected after his famous turn. I'll go into that a bit later. Academics, especially philosophers in the academy, generally consider being in time to be Heidegger's seminal work. And this is because it's still written in the tradition of academic philosophy, and it's accessible to academicians. The being in time is grounded in Husserlian phenomenology and its methodology, and it's familiar to them. The post-turn Heidegger resolutely rejected philosophy itself as the dead carcass of metaphysics and took a different path entirely. It is at this point, Heidegger's turn, that he came into his own as the giant of 20th century thought and left the academy behind blinking in confusion. We simple bikers, however, under the bridges, remain enthralled by this later thought and remain convinced that if all we knew of Heidegger were being in time and what is metaphysics, he would have remained at the lower rank of fascist apologists such as Carl Schmitt. Let's look at a couple of short excerpts from Millerman, and then I'll respond.
My claim here is that we should consider that there's not only no way out of our crisis, but also no possibility of understanding it for what it is without a foundation in Heidegger's thought. So now a brief introductory comments on Heidegger himself. Heidegger, who was born in 1889 and died in 1976, also addressed himself to a crisis, to the foundations of things, but in this case, writing and being in time in 1927, Heidegger discusses how there was then a crisis in the sciences, including in mathematics, that concerned foundational concepts and therefore invited thoughtful philosophical regrounding and reconstitution of those sciences. But that could only happen, he argued, as a result of a more basic inquiry into their structure of being. So fundamental concepts, he wrote, are determinations in which the area of knowledge underlying all the thematic objects of a science attains an understanding that precedes and guides all positive investigation. So I'll just explain. For instance, the concepts of nature and life are presupposed by and guide physics and biology. In other words, he says all sciences somehow treat a region of beings, or they demarcate or delineate some area that is given by a set of fundamental or basic concepts that the science itself doesn't necessarily inquire into with its own methods and as its own subject matter. It's a presupposed guiding horizon. To ground the sciences philosophically, in other words, is to clarify the being of their basic concepts through questions like what is nature, what is life, or for psychology, what is the soul, and more fundamentally, at the basis of all of these inquiries, what is being itself. The sciences, as I said, do not raise these questions themselves and can't answer them with their own methods, which is why they can't respond to the crisis in their own foundations. It's an invitation for philosophy to step up and do the work. A crisis in the foundations of some established and instituted domain, therefore, invites us to reinterpret those domains in terms of the constitution of their being, using tools of philosophical analysis that must also be properly grounded. So the correct methodological access to the issue of foundations is fundamental for Heidegger. And what I wanted to say in closing here is that the opportunity that the current crisis presents us with, I would say, is the following. If we accept Heidegger's invitation to turn to fundamental ontology as a source of self-understanding that lies at the basis of our world order, economy, institutions of health, and systems of everyday life, then together with the deconstruction of metaphysics, we'd have to make the task of another beginning of philosophy our own and start to experiment with the concept formation of a Dasein politics, not a politics of soul, politics of spirit, but Dasein politics. This prospect is more radical and less likely than some of the better known alternatives, and also more essential. The only political philosopher I know of who has accepted the challenge openly, unconcerned about the supposed slope to radical right-wing anti-liberalism, is Alexander Dugin, whose fourth political theory should therefore be of particular interest to us in this our Heideggerian.
Millerman describes the Heidegger of being in time as concerned with addressing the crisis of science, which is its captivity to metaphysical objectification that has the result of uprooting science from being itself and obscures its grounding. Heidegger approaches this through philosophical methods and tools, as Millerman had mentioned, to understand the fundamental being which precedes all our concepts and interpretation. Heidegger called this project fundamental ontology. Heidegger put it this way in Being in Time. Basically, all ontology, no matter how rich and firmly compacted a system of categories it has at its disposal, remains blind and perverted from its ownmost aim if it has not first adequately clarified the meaning of being and conceived this clarification as its fundamental task. Therefore, he called die Seinsfrage, or the question of being, remained his sole focus for the rest of his life, but his approach turned 180 degrees after Being in Time. As Heidegger himself described, this was the famous turn. Before we go further with Being in Time and Millerman's interpretation, it's critical to understand Heidegger's place and time within Western thought. Heidegger stood at the end of the last two major thrusts of Western philosophy, the first being the 2-century-long journey toward the destruction of metaphysics, beginning with Francis Bacon and ending with Friedrich Nietzsche. The other major thrust, which began about a century later with the Romantics, was the overturning of reason as the mode of apprehending truth in favor of aesthetics, which again Nietzsche brought to fruition. Being in Time focused on the first of the two trends and attempted to build upon what he saw as Nietzsche's ending of metaphysics. He saw a way of grounding the sciences in being itself, thereby eliminating all metaphysical speculation and, importantly, the subject-object dichotomy to which metaphysics gave birth. He attempted this project through the phenomenological analysis of Dasein and its cognitive structure as it interprets being. Dasein here is the essence of man as being and as the self-awareness of being in the world. It actually literally means being there. It's our consciousness of being in the world itself as a part of being. The fatal flaw in this approach is that there still lurks the dark figure of metaphysics in the assumed Kantian transcendental idealism and Husserlian transcendental hermeneutics. The only overcoming of the subject-object dichotomy he could manage within this framework was what he called Zuhandensein, which is, it literally means being to hand, which is the entanglement of man and tool in work. This would be radically rethought after the turn when he finally includes the second thrust of philosophy, aesthetic experience of truth. It's important to note that Heidegger never finished Being in Time. It was planned as a two-part work, the first part covering being, the second part covering time, but all he ever completed was the first 2/3 of the first half of the book, Being, and then he put it away, never to turn to it again. In his later years, he referred to Being in Time in an interview as an example of writing too soon. Through the 30s and the 40s, we can trace the move of his moving away from philosophy and toward what he called poetic thinking. This turn is clearly seen in his collection in 1947 of essays in a book called Holzwege, which means paths through the woods. The most important aspects of this turn are, first, transferring the focus from the modes of Dasein in interpreting being to being itself and man's nature as a part of being. Second was replacing the analytical methods of phenomenology with aesthetic exploration of being through poetry and poetic thinking. And lastly, the all-important term in German Ereignis, as the experience of the revelation of being. There is a many-layered resonance in the German word of Ereignis. And it has hints of authenticity, of occurrence, of excitation, but what it really means is that profound experience of being revealing itself to Dasein. This move to aesthetic mode of knowledge replaced phenomenological explanation of interpretation of being with this notion of Ereignis, where we experience the truth as being reveals itself through a partial unconcealing of its nature. We experience this poetically as originating language, as being speaks through man. It's not, poetry is not something that, when it's authentic poetry, is not something that man invents or makes up or creates. It's being speaking through man as it disconceals or unconceals an aspect of itself.
Ich habe im Jahre 1964 in einem Vortrag in Paris, den ich nicht selber gehalten habe, der in französischer Übersetzung vorgetragen wurde, unter dem Titel gesprochen, das Ende der Philosophie und die Aufgabe des Denkens. Ich mache also einen Unterschied zwischen Philosophie, das heißt Metaphysik, und dem Denken, so wie ich es verstehe. Dieses Denken ist in der Sache sehr viel einfacher als die Philosophie, aber im Vollzug sehr viel schwieriger und verlangt eine neue Sorgfalt der Sprache. Keine Erfindung neuer Termini, wie ich einmal dachte, sondern ein Rückgang auf den ursprünglichen Gehalt unserer eigenen, aber ständig im Absterben begriffenen Sprache. Und ein kommender Denker, der vielleicht vor die Aufgabe gestellt wird, dieses Denken, das ich vorzubereiten suche, wirklich zu übernehmen.
This is the real fruition of Nietzsche's aesthetic, much as Zarathustra experienced atop the mountain at midnight, looking at the moon through the laciness of the spider web and experiencing the most profound truth, and through him sang the drunken song.
Allein, es gibt noch andere Verhältnisse als die gewöhnlichen. Goethe nennt diese anderen Verhältnisse die tieferen und sagt, von der Sprache. Im gemeinen Leben kommen wir mit der Sprache notdürftig aus, weil wir nur oberflächliche Verhältnisse bezeichnen. Sobald von tieferen Verhältnissen die Rede ist, tritt sogleich eine andere Sprache ein, die poetische.
Millerman's argument is problematic. First, it attempts to solve the problem of a crisis of politics before we have addressed the underlying question of being, and doing this through Heidegger's phenomenological methodology, which Heidegger himself rejected. In Millerman's introduction in the video linked to below, he actually warns against this, talking about how Heidegger says we should, we should move below already thought interpretations or conceptions of things to the very ground of being itself, and from that would emerge a more authentic approach. Yet here, Millerman, before we have any clue of the question of being, is already trying to philosophically approach political theory. This is a common mistake, which we see in Sartre's application of Heidegger's analytics of being and time to existentialism, in Derrida's exploiting the notion of hermeneutics as a way to deconstruct metaphysical assumptions lurking in all Dasein interpretations of being. Being uprooted from its ground, however, the latter two end up either declaring truth as an invention or not even existent. It is interesting that at the end of the clip I presented, Millerman actually says the deconstruction of metaphysics using the Derridian term rather than Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics, and there's a huge difference between deconstruction and destruction. But for Heidegger, it's no longer a matter of method by which we deconstruct the past or other such superficial games, but rather building on the destruction of metaphysics in order to prepare the ground to a poetic relation to the truth and essence of being. Let's compare the attempt to construct a politics of Dasein with a question once asked of Heidegger why he never wrote anything on morality. He answered, "We don't yet even know the questions to ask." What he meant was we first need to pursue the Seinsfrage, and then an authentic morality can emerge out of our nature and the nature of being. The same would apply to the question of politics. In his famous interview with the German magazine Der Spiegel, Heidegger dismissed all political formations and instead pivoted to the one true appropriate question, as he called it, the fragenswürdige, or worthy of being questioned issue, before we can address any others, and that's our relation to being and the essence of technology. This is the new beginning he had in mind, and saw himself as the preparer of the ground on which this work could begin.
Es ist jenes Fragwürdige, wofür wir heute noch nicht einmal den rechten Namen kennen, dass sich die technisch beherrschbare Natur der Wissenschaft und die natürliche Natur des gewohnten, gleichfalls geschichtlich bestimmten Wohnens des Menschen, wie es ist jenes Fragwürdige, dass die beherrschbare Natur als die vermeintlich wahre Welt alles Sinnen und Trachten des Menschen an sich reißt und das menschliche Vorstellen zu einem bloß rechnenden Denken verändert und verhärtet. Es ist jenes Fragwürdige, dass die natürliche Natur in das Nichtige
eines Fantasiegebildes herabsinkt und nicht einmal mehr die Dichter anspricht. Es ist jenes Fragwürdige, dass die Dichtung selbst keine maßgebende Gestalt der Wahrheit mehr zu sein vermag.
Until we understand those relationships and the authentic essence of technology, the metaphysical thinking of technology will continue to close off our approach to being, as he explains here in a television interview.
Also vor allem das Missverständnis ist abzusehen, als ob ich gegen die Technik sei. Ganz im Gegenteil, ich sehe in der Technik, in ihrem Wesen nämlich, dass der Mensch unter einer Macht steht, die ihn herausfordert und der gegenüber er nicht mehr frei ist. Dass sich hier etwas ankündigt, nämlich ein Bezug des Seins zum Menschen. Und dass dieser Bezug, der sich im Wesen der Technik verbirgt, eines Tages vielleicht in seiner Unverborgenheit ans Licht kommt. Ob das geschieht, weiß ich nicht. Ich sehe also im Wesen der Technik den ersten Vorschein eines sehr viel tieferen Geschehnisses, was ich das Ereignis nenne.
What Millerman proposes is not an authentic application of Heidegger. We are not ready even to know the right questions to ask about politics. And early in his career, Heidegger had given up on philosophy's ability to resolve anything. When we do learn the right questions from a true grounding in being, political formation will emerge. Heidegger's crisis cannot be substituted for by any other crisis of our choosing, but is the most fundamental question of all. Die Seinsfrage. Until we have a grasp of that, we simply revert to more metaphysical errors. In his long poem of 1965, Aus der Erfahrung des Denkens, which leans from the experience of thought, Heidegger gives us a line that perfectly encapsulates all of what I described above and what serves me as the touchstone to Heidegger and our place in time. Wir kommen für die Götter zu spät und zu früh für das Sein, dessen angefangenes Gedicht ist der Mensch. Roughly translated, that means we come too late for the gods and too soon for being. Whose just begun poem is man. Here we are in Nietzsche's time of the great vertigo as a result of the madman's announcement of the death of God, which is the last effect of the destruction of metaphysics. Whereas Heidegger calls it the time of destitution. In the aforementioned volume Holzwege, where he writes an essay entitled Wozu Dichter, which means what are poets for? It's taken from a line of Hölderlin's poem, and the line Wozu Dichter in dürftiger Zeit, which means what are poets for in times of destitution? We now are ungrounded and in a vertiginous floating stuck between the time of the gods and the time of being until we discover the way to being, and that way cannot be through philosophy or science, but only through poetic experience of Ereignis. And that is what poets and authentic thinkers are for. Our own essential destiny is that of the poet. Our purpose is to be the poetic experience of being for being itself. It's just begun poem. Being speaks through us as the manifestation of experience itself in which we and being share. Poetry is not just some avocation for Heidegger, but the only way to recover what we lost through metaphysics. When logos, in its original and full meaning of the word, as the musical revelation of being in the world with its resonance full of the manifold of presence of being, that is, being speaking through man, was attenuated to the desiccant impoverishment of logic. When logos became logic, we lost our connection to being and have been uprooted in metaphysics ever since. To conclude, much political mischief has been committed by attempting to derive political theory from Heidegger's early and abandoned phenomenology, starting with Heidegger himself and his early support of Nazism, Sartre's embrace of communism, and Alexander Dugin's use of it as dressing in camouflage over Putin's thugocracy, as well as lesser lights in America who distort and name-drop Heidegger in an attempt to legitimize their crude and ugly populist nationalism. I'm considering addressing Dugin in more detail later on in another video or perhaps an essay on my blog. Millerman has produced some good translations, although much of Dugin is not yet translated, and translations other than Millerman's that I have seen are not very good. As is the case with Heidegger, however, I find it necessary to read it in the original. Dugin's faux Heideggerianism only mimics Heidegger's tracing of words to their authentic beings in Dugin's attempt to reveal a supposed authentic Russian interpretation of being and culture, an enterprise that leads not to any originating logos, but rather a maze of fallen language which easily elides into nationalism. He furthers this through his concept of mass Dasein, a shared Dasein or experience of being, which eerily echoes Heidegger's early embrace of nationalism as an authentic mass experience of Nietzschean will, as described by Jürgen Habermas in his criticism of Heidegger, and echoes the dark myth of Volk with the Russian Narod. But make no mistake, Dugin's fourth political theory is no authentic thinking of being, but inauthentic window dressing for authoritarian brutality. It cannot possibly be further removed from the poetic inquiry of being.